Welcome. My name is Troy McKenzie. I have the privilege of being the Dean of NYU School of Law, and I am thrilled to welcome everyone to this year's Robert A. Katzman Symposium. It's going to be a wonderful evening of a conversation between Judge Ann Claire Williams and me on a number of topics, from her life, connecting to the legacy of Bob Katzman, and more importantly, the role of the judiciary and social change. I will not say too much more because I want to jump into our conversation. For those of you who know Judge Williams, she has had an amazing life and career, an extraordinarily rich set of experiences and reflections. So I will sit down and let the conversation begin. So, Judge Williams, welcome. Welcome to NYU. I wanted to...
And may I say thank you for having me?
Welcome. Yes,
and
you may.
say good evening to everyone. And how excited I am to be here, how honored I am, because Bob Katzman and Bob was my brother of the heart. And we had so much in common, and we shared so much, so this is a tremendous honor. And to see everyone in the audience, some of my law clerks, some of the judges that I worked with over the years, some of my partners in not-for-profit organizations, and the faculty, I'm really thrilled to be here, so thank you for having me.
Great. So why don't we begin at the beginning, talking about how you became a lawyer and then you're becoming a judge. You are from Detroit. Your parents were teachers. You went to Wayne State for your undergraduate education. You then received a master's from the University of Michigan. What were some of your influences? You've talked about your parents being influential, people like Judge Katzman. Do you have reflections on lessons you learned from those people and how they influenced you?
Well, that was something that Bob and I really had in common, our parents, because my parents had the greatest influence on me. Both of my parents were from South Carolina, segregated South. Both wanted and were the first in their families to go to college, historically black colleges. They worked their way through college. When they moved to Detroit, my mother had a degree in education, but blacks were not given contracts in education. And so for 12 years, she worked at a school for delinquent children, and then 5 years as a substitute teacher. And then finally, she got a contract. My father had a degree in political science and psychology. He moved to Detroit. He tried to sell insurance. He didn't sell one policy. So he then drove a bus, and he drove a bus for 20 years, along with many black men who were accountants, lawyers, because the opportunities weren't there. And in his 20th year, he applied for a position as a supervisor. His white boss said to him he was not competent. Daddy had been a staff sergeant in the military, had helped run a division. He got very upset. He looked at his pension fund and said, I think on my pension fund, I can go back to school. And as fate would have it, Daddy and I were at Wayne State together because my major was education. And of course, I had never thought about that because I loved my father. You know, I loved his uniform. I thought he was very handsome. I could run up and down the bus, getting before the end of the line. And then there are some people here who remember when you paid with real money in the bus. And so I was able to roll quarters, dimes, and nickels. So I was in a class. I was asked to do an extemporaneous speech about who I admired, and I started talking about my father, and tears were streaming down my cheeks because that's when it hit me. Bus driver, college degree, bus driver. I came home, I said, Daddy, how could you stand it? Why aren't you burning down the city of Detroit? And he said, I did what I had to do. I knew what I had to do to make life better for you and your two sisters. He said, and nobody can take my education away from me. And being a bus driver is good, honest, decent work. And I know that if you have the skills, you will make it better you will make it better in the world. And so it's my parents that have influenced me, and everybody in this room, whether you were enslaved people who were brought here against your will, whether your people crossed the big water like Bob's parents, looking for shelter, looking for peace, looking for democracy, we all stand on their shoulders. And so whenever I have faced a challenge, I think about my parents. And if that's not going back far enough, I say, well, I could be a slave. And look at all the people that have sacrificed so we could all be in this room. And we have an obligation to make the world better because of how much they sacrificed for us so we could be in this room and we could hold these positions. So bottom line is, just like the Katzmans, my parents were my greatest influence and my greatest inspiration.
Great. So you talked about that experience. Did you have other formative experiences that shaped in particular your view of justice, the role of the courts, the judiciary?
And I went back when I was asked to do this, and I thought, the Roosevelt Journal, when I was in 6th grade, I did an article on who are the freedom riders. My parents were very aware of civil rights. I knew about Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, Martin Luther King. In fact, I went to one of his rallies in Detroit when I was a little girl. I stood on the corner collecting money for the freedom riders. So we grew up in a family, was very conscious of race relations in this country, talked about justice, understood justice, but I never imagined I would be a lawyer. I mean, who's a lawyer that influenced me? Just like Justice Sotomayor, Perry Mason. That's who came to my house every week. And so Perry Mason won every case, cross-examined the witness, and the witness confessed, or turned to the gallery, cross-examined someone in the gallery, and they confessed. So Perry, I understood Perry. I had very fundamental views about justice. And so, but I never, at that time, women were teachers, social workers, nurses, administrative assistants. All the women in my family, in my extended family, worked in the factory because we were from Detroit. The men worked in the factory in Detroit. I never, ever imagined I would be a lawyer.
So you do end up going to law school at University of Notre Dame. How did you decide to make that leap? How did you end up in law school? What attracted you to the law? And how did you get there?
Well, I had a friend who was getting his master's in social work while I was getting my master's in guidance and counseling, and I had been teaching full-time in the inner city public schools of Detroit. I taught for 4 years. And so he came by one day and said, "What are you doing next year?" I said, "I'm not sure." And he said, "Well, I'm going to law school." I had a competitive spirit, and I said, "So am I." And he said, "You need to take a test." I said, "You're kidding. I didn't need to take a test to get into Michigan. I had high enough grades. I got admitted to the graduate program." He went down, got the form, got the LSAT. I had no anxiety, no prep whatsoever, and thank God I did well. Problem was I took the test in February, and when I applied to Harvard, Yale, Michigan, Notre Dame, and Wayne State, classes were filled. So I got rejection letters. But it was during that period of rejection that it hit me. Lawyers teach and teachers teach. Teachers have to persuade, lawyers have to persuade. Teachers have to break down material so people understand it and move people, and that's what lawyers have to do. So at some point I said, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could be a lawyer. And then as fate would have it, another friend was at Notre Dame walking with the only Black person on the admissions committee on our faculty, the assistant law librarian, Granville Cleveland, who happened to mention someone canceled in the class. And Willie Lipscomb, who later became a judge in Detroit, said, "I know someone." And so that's why I have my rejection letter from Notre Dame and my admissions letter. And so I rolled in the campus the day before. Like I said, I didn't know a lawyer or a judge. I rolled in, I was so happy. I called Willie. I said, "Willie, I'm in the dorm. I have my parking space." And he said, and I quote, "Ann Claire, have you done the reading?" To which I said, "Willie, what are you talking about?" Tomorrow's the first day of class. I'll get the syllabus, I'll buy my books, and then I'll do the readings. He said, no, Aunt Claire, we're in the same section. Get in your Volkswagen and get over here. So I got over there without GPS, because there are some young people in the audience, but we had to find our way, and Willie literally had to explain everything, because I knew, plaintiff, defendant, but I didn't understand how the courts worked. I didn't understand what a holding was. And so in the margins, that's how I started. That's how I started law school. And I like to say the students said, look where I ended up. So as we share our stories and our journeys, students here can go way beyond where I went, but that's how I started. And it ended up that it was a good thing. It ended up that it was a good thing, and I had made the right choice.
Do you remember any particular courses or experiences in law school that were especially influential for your later career?
Well, the president of Notre Dame at the time was Father Ted Hesburgh, who had been the chair of the Civil Rights Division. And Howard Glickstein, who had been his general counsel, started the Civil Rights Center at Notre Dame. And I was fortunate enough to be a legal research assistant. That was influential. I also made the choice to work with Willie as assistant director of legal aid. And we were doing a book drive for the prisons. We were teaching legal writing in the prisons. In hindsight, I should have taken the offer to join the moot court team. But again, I said I didn't understand the significance and how important it was to have an academic credential. But thank God I was a research assistant. And then trial advocacy appealed to me, as well as criminal law and federal procedure. So I also worked for the Black Cultural Center in South Bend, and sadly, we were conducting police misconduct hearings, something that is with us even today. So those were things that influenced me, and I like to think when I was working with the prisoners, the Indiana State prisoners, when I ended up on the 7th Circuit, this was my payback to be a 7th Circuit judge and to deal with all the prisoner cases that got filed. But those things had an influence on me, and of course, by that time, I knew a lot more about Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley.
You were fortunate enough to be able to begin your career as a law clerk on the court that you would later join, the 7th Circuit, for Judge Sprecher. Could you tell us how you got the job and how you decided that you were going to apply for a clerkship? And then what were some of the experiences and lessons that you learned in that position?
Well, I got called to the dean's office. Back then there wasn't an electronic means to communicate, and the dean used to just post little missives. But anyway, the dean called me and said, I received a call from Judge Luther Swigert, who's a Notre Dame law grad. He's the chief judge of the 7th Circuit. There have only been 1 or 2 women law clerks in the history of the court, and no Black women. And he asked me if I knew an outstanding Black woman that could cut it, that could be a law clerk.
It was that direct?
Yes, he was very direct. Dean Link was very direct. And he said to me, Ann, have you ever thought about clerking? Well, in the setup to that question, I had thought about clerking. So I said, yes, Dean, I thought about clerking. Because one of the things I've learned lessons in life is you have to say yes. You never know when an opportunity is going to present itself to you. And you never know where it's going to lead. But I knew that was a good thing, that the dean thought I was strong enough academically to handle a clerkship. So I said yes. So I went, interviewed on the 7th Circuit. Swigert wanted to hire 3 women. He only had 2 spots. He called his next door neighbor, Bob Sprecher, and said, have you filled your 2nd position? He said, no. He said, I'd like you to consider Ann Williams. And so when I walked in the courthouse, I went to Judge Swigert's chambers. There was another Black woman, and so we were the first 2 Black women on the court. And we helped each other. We did our drafts. We exchanged drafts. We helped each other. We edited. We became lifelong friends. And so my experience was very good with Bob Sprecher. He was a gifted writer. And so we divided the docket in 3s. My co-clerk drafted a 3rd. I drafted a 3rd, and the judge drafted a 3rd. And of course, back in those days, if you had something in what was it, the U.S. U.S. Law Week. If one of your cases got featured, that was a big thing. So the judge had one, I had one, and my co-clerk. So it was a great year. It was a great year. He was a great mentor to me, and it's one of my it's very sad to me that he never saw me go onto the bench.
What influence did that clerkship have on your later career?
Well, the clerkship is a golden ticket. It's a golden ticket. It unlocks many doors. And so I had offers from a major law firm and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the relationship with Bob Sprecher and his strength in writing, because before, after I studied for the bar, I read like 100 opinions of Judge Sprecher, so I would be ready. So I understood the way he analyzed things, I understood how he set up opinions, and so when I turned my first draft in, which took 6 weeks, the secretary finally said, "Ann, Judge is asking for your draft." And that was back in the day when there was real cut and paste. And so she said, "You've done like 5. Turn it in." And then I got it back. There were like 3 little red marks. I knew I was on my way, and I never forgot the lessons that he taught me. So I learned a lot in the clerkship.
Right. So after the clerkship, you took your first job at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. What attracted you to that position, and how did you end up becoming an assistant U.S. attorney?
Well, I really wanted to, I actually applied to the Federal Defender's Office. I never wanted to be a prosecutor. And there was another woman who reached out to me, Mary Ann Jackson. She was the only black woman in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and she asked to have lunch with me. And she said, "I wanted to talk to you because she said, I want to just make clear that if you're the prosecutor, you have the power. The prosecutor indicts. The prosecutor makes recommendations on sentencing. The prosecutor has to make sure the agents conduct their investigations consistent with the law." And she said, "It's very important that we, as black people, and really every segment of society is represented in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and you can make sure people really understand their rights. And it is, in my opinion, a better spot for you." I thought about what Mary Ann said, and that convinced me, and so I applied to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I was trying to decide whether I'd take the offer with the law firm or the U.S. Attorney's Office, even though I knew I wanted that. And I was offered the position in the U.S. Attorney's Office, but not in the division I wanted, criminal receiving and appellate. Duh, I had been an appellate clerk, but it turns out they had a division called public protection and civil rights. And so very interestingly, me, the other black guy, and 3 white women, we were all in that group, and everybody else, including some of my former clerks, were in this criminal receiving and appellate division. But I knew I had to get my foot in the door, so that was a lesson too. Sometimes you can't get what you want when you want it, and so you have to adjust and figure out what door you're gonna go to next. And for me, getting my foot in the door was really important, so I said yes. After 3 months, I recognized that civil rights criminal investigations are really hard, and if you've never done a search warrant, or you've never done an arrest warrant, or you've never worked with agents in terms of how you conduct an investigation, you are not operating at full capacity, let's say. And so I went to the chief of the division I wanted to be in. I said, you know, I've tried it, 3 months, not learning a lot. I'd like to transfer. He said no. So I went to, there was a guy who was 2 offices from me named Bob. And Bob, I had heard him complaining because a lot of the guys in that division I wanted to be in, they didn't like doing briefs. So I went to my group and I said, hey, would you all like to do briefs for the 7th Circuit? I said, I'm gonna go see Bob to see if he'll assign us some briefs. And that's what I did. So I said, Bob, can we do briefs? He's like, yes, you really want it? I said, yeah. So then Bob started giving us briefs from the 7th Circuit. I got to argue in the 7th Circuit. So then Bob, I wanted to get duty days where we could do arrest warrants, search warrants. I went to the chief of the division. No, I went to Bob. I said, Bob, I need you to go to the chief. And you need to get duty days for us. And Bob Came back, he said, I got you 3. I said, that's a start. And so even though I ended up a year behind my fellow AUSAs, I ultimately got in the division I belonged in and began to try cases. So the point is, one has to stand up for oneself. And my parents really had 5 lessons for me: dream big dreams, work really hard, never give up, stand up, and give back. And so that stand up, because nobody's going to give you anything. And so that's a lesson for me. You have to, if you want it, you have to go out after it, and you have to think very strategically about it. And I think those lessons I learned were very helpful for me. As you know, John, we negotiated it with the Judicial Conference and all the different things that ended up coming to be in my life. I learned a lot of lessons in the U.S. Attorney's Office, including, as I said, saying yes. So the chief judge called me. I was on maternity leave with my first child, and he knew I had been teaching trial at Northwestern. I'd done trial at Harvard. I taught trial at the Attorney General's program. And so he said, we're starting a trial bar in the Northern District of Illinois. I'd like you to be one of the members of the committee. So again, not quite as sophisticated as I later became. I said to the chief, how many meetings, how long will they be? And I hung up the phone. I said, that's the chief judge asking you to serve on the committee. I called him right back. I said, yes. So that yes is very important. And so on that committee, Jim Holderman, who became a district judge, Alana Rovner became a district judge. Another judge on that committee became a state court judge. Little did I know the chair of the committee was the son of a federal judge, Dick Austin. And so my name, I got known, I got a reputation. And so they stood up for me when it was time for the district court. Similarly, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, my last position was chief of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. And when the U.S. Attorney asked me about it, because I wanted another position, and I went to him and said, I heard I'm not getting this position. I wanted to be chief. He said, oh, no, I want you to be chief of the Drug Task Force. And I said, I've done my time in drugs. I don't want that job. And he said, oh, no, you have to report to Washington. At the time, Rudy Giuliani was number 3 at the department. And you will have 5 U.S. attorneys you work with. As fate would have it, and unbeknownst to me, because I was not in politics at all, I had been covered under the Hatch Act, Sarah Barker, Joe Stadtmuller, Jim Rosenbaum, all became federal judges. So they had connections, and they stood up for me when my name came up. And so again, saying yes when I didn't know where it was going to go, but I did have sense enough to ask the U.S. Attorney, would I get a raise and would I be a chief? Because I knew I didn't want to go back to that same division when I was a deputy. So again, a lesson.
So let's talk a little bit about when you took the bench. 1985, you were appointed to the Northern District as a district judge, and you were the 3rd woman on that court. You were the 3rd black judge on that court. What were some of the experiences like when you first took the bench? And do you have recollections about the actual process of being nominated and confirmed and then starting out opening up your chambers?
Well, it was, I mentioned all the U.S. attorneys that stood up for me. And I didn't even know all that was going on behind the scenes. And then Lowell Jensen had replaced Rudy Giuliani. And so he had, again, all unbeknownst to me, he had worked for Lowell Jensen in California. Lowell Jensen, Ed Meese was White House counsel. And I had done several conferences, because when you're in the task force, you're bringing together all these different agents, you're doing a lot of education, you're working out the budget for these investigations, you're thinking about the strategies. So he had seen a window and had seen me in leadership positions. And so with that background, plus I mentioned that I'd been teaching trial ad, I was also involved with the National Institute for Trial Advocacy. So one of the things people said was no civil experience, but I had been teaching trial ad. I worked for Jim McElhaney as his assistant team leader. He was editor-in-chief of the American Bar Association Litigation Magazine. So a lot of these things I had done, I wasn't doing that to work for the judgeship. In fact, when the U.S. Attorney called me and said my name had come up, I was like, are you serious? There were so few black women in the country who were on the bench. And he said, yes, your name has come up to Senator Percy. Senator Percy had kind of a kitchen cabinet. He didn't have a formal committee. And I was on my way to buy a dryer. I was pregnant with my second child. My mother was in the car. It was 90 degrees. Senator Percy's office called and they wanted to interview me. And so I spoke with that person. And then the next person wanted to interview me, but I was on my way to get this dryer. So I stopped. I knew there was one department store that had really nice ladies' room and had a nice, because the first call I took at the Amoco with my ear like this, because at the time I was living in Michigan. My husband had taken an appointment in Detroit, and I was on leave from the U.S. Attorney's office. And so it wasn't like they could call an office. So I talked when I was at the Amoco station, and then I decided I needed to be in a more quiet space. And so I did the interview, and then ultimately, now I chair the American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary. I'm in my second term. I've been appointed by the incoming president for my third term, where we review all the nominees to the District Court, Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court. But at that time, there were 7 bar associations that had to interview me. Each of them had a different form. So we were cutting and pasting, and my husband had taken a new job, so I didn't even really have secretarial help, so he paid his secretary to do the work. And so the rumor at the bank was he was having an affair because they were there at night so late. So eventually, though, I was nominated into the district court. And you were asking what it was like. Of course, it's a magnificent thing to have the weight on your shoulders, to know that you are the difference you will make in people's lives. And I had tried a lot of cases. So I felt very confident about understanding the rules of evidence, the way things worked. In fact, I had more experience than a lot of the judges on the court, so I was not worried about that. But it's the burden and the responsibility to make sure that you represent justice, that you are being fair. And so I took a lot of time when I did guilty pleas. I didn't try to do them in 20 minutes. If someone hesitated or didn't understand, or I was explaining things, I think part of that was being a teacher. And I would just say, do you need more time? You need to talk to defense counsel? Do you understand that anything you say can be held against you? You see that woman sitting there, she's the court reporter. She's writing down everything you say. And if this goes to trial, everything you say can be used in the trial against you. Do you understand that? I never got reversed on any guilty plea. And I did that in the U.S. Attorney's Office too, because somehow poor people who have not had experience with the law want to come into the grand jury and talk. Sophisticated criminals don't come when you call them into the grand jury, and if they have lawyers. But I would always say, there's a lawyer to represent you, federal defender, not paid by us. I'm the one that puts you in jail. They're available. So to me, making sure people understood their rights was really, really important.
So you later went to the Court of Appeals in 1999, and I wanted to just put something to you as a proposition to hear your response. It sometimes is said that district judges have by far the most influence in the federal judiciary because, one, they do not need to get other judges to agree with their view in order to reach a decision. And two, their decisions are typically reviewed with, as a practical matter, significant deference by appellate courts, so that district judges have a great degree of freedom and influence. Do you have thoughts about that? Do you agree?
Well, I think who has the greatest influence is the Supreme Court. That's where the greatest influence is. But I do agree with you that district judges have a lot of power, and because you're deciding yourself what the fair thing is. You look at the facts, you look at the law, you make the best decision. I was not someone that did a lot of hand-wringing. like I know Harry Edwards didn't do either. You spend the amount of time that you need to understand the facts, to understand the law. You hire great law clerks who help you with that, and then you make the decision. And if they come in on a motion to reconsider, you listen to that. You look at it. We were not perfect. I was not perfect on the bench. And so if I needed to reconsider, I would. I think that a good judge understands that. A judge who doesn't have problems with confidence or insecurities is willing to say, I'm not right 100% of the time. But you do have a lot of power as a district court judge, and you are justice to the jurors that come in, to the witnesses that come in the way that you treat them. I was telling a story before we started. I love juries, and I always, I gave them a questionnaire at the beginning. I explained all their rights, and I was teaching trial ed in Minnesota, and it turned out one of the lawyers I was working with, his mother had been a juror in my courtroom. And he said, oh, I know who you are. I said, really? He said, yes, because you always ask, how many children do you have? What do they do? What are their ages? And he said, my mother had 12. And she named all their names and what they did, and you said, let us give a round of applause to them. And I always did that, whoever had the most children, because I wanted to get them relaxed enough that I could show my human side so that I could get honest responses. So I always gave a certificate to every juror. We mailed it. And so this lawyer says, I knew it was you because you said, and my mother told me, you said, will everybody give her a round of applause because she knows all the names? And she framed the certificate. And so that mattered to me because to me, being on the jury is next to military service and treating them with respect, being on time. So if lawyers were, I would warn a lawyer, you were late, jury is ready. Okay, don't do that again, counsel. If that happened again, if we started at 10, we were all in the courtroom waiting, jury and everybody else. Lawyer comes in. How often do you think that lawyer was late? Not after that one time when we were already, counsel, you're here, so we'll get started now. Only one time. Because you have to respect the jury. You have to respect their time. So it is a very powerful position. And in terms of thinking about the Court of Appeals, yes, as a trial judge, you obviously have to be aware of the law. And you have to know when you're coming to the line. And you have to decide as a judge, is it the right thing if I come to the line and I cross the line? Do I have a tight enough record? Do I have enough law so that I might be able to persuade the Court of Appeals? But you have to be very judicious about that. You can't do that with every case because then you get a reputation on the Court of Appeals of not being a solid judge that can be relied on. And just like lawyers have reputations and lawyers talk about us as judges, judges talk about judges. And in the Court of Appeals, we knew who the judges were that made a great record. And so when you had to make a call, a judge that you trusted, that you knew made a good record, that was very thoughtful, you often give them the benefit of the doubt. Give them the benefit of the credibility as a trial judge mattered, and it mattered in the Court of Appeals, who the lawyers are and who the judges were.
So I want to talk to you about a couple things you did when you took the bench. One, which was really quite extraordinary, is that when you were a district judge, you presided over a lengthy multi-district litigation called In Re Folding Carton antitrust litigation. And that litigation ended in a national settlement. Following the settlement, there was a reserve of unclaimed funds, and you decided in a decision to enter a Cypre order distributing those funds in order to establish a public interest fellowship that was proposed by the National Association for Public Interest Law. And I want to talk a little bit about that because you, as a district judge, had this authority and opportunity. I'm going to read how you explain that decision. In sum, having a permanent source of funding for public interest legal work has far-reaching benefits. It benefits recipients of the legal services. It benefits graduating law students and judicial clerks who have a desire to practice public interest law. It benefits public interest organizations. It benefits society as a whole to achieve justice for those who might not otherwise have access to the legal system. For these reasons, the court finds that using the reserve fund to establish the National Public Interest Fellowship is appropriate under the Cypre doctrine, and the court adopts the proposal of the committee in its entirety. Could you talk a little bit about that and what that launched, and then we'll talk about whether that could be done today?
So I had heard about the Skadden Arps program, and they had said they were going to do a program for 5 years to fund fellowships for lawyers working in the public interest area. I thought that was a brilliant idea. And when I had this money, I had $2.3 million. I had a committee that I appointed, and I said, here's what I want to do. I would like to make this a permanent fellowship program. So I need you to go find an organization that we think is capable of running a fellowship program. So National Association of Public Interest Law had been founded by law students several years before. And they identified them, I interviewed them. I thought they had the capacity, and I didn't preside over the case. Actually, I got it the third round because the district judge who had the case had been rejected twice by the Seventh Circuit for the way he wanted to distribute the funds, to establish an antitrust department in one of the law schools, and then another thing, he wanted to send the money to the Federal Judges Association, the Federal Judiciary, the Federal, the Federal Education, the
FJC.
Federal Judicial Center,
FJC.
right? And the Seventh Circuit rejected that. So then it comes to me, and I knew I wanted it for all those reasons you said, and then I wanted to have a provision where the students their loans were paid off, because I could see on the bench that kids were making the choice not to do public interest work because the salaries were so low, because their loans were so big. And we know in this country, we are not serving all the people who need to be served. I don't know what the stats are now, but is it 40 or 50% of the people can't get a lawyer? It's probably higher than that. I didn't check that data. So anyway, I appointed the committee found National Association of Public Interest Law. I interviewed them. I appointed the first board. I kept track of the money. There was $800,000 in a Cypre here in New York. One of my committee members got that judge to give it. So we started with $3.1 million. We started with 7 fellows in 1991. Now we've had over 2,000 fellows in the country doing and now the name is Equal Justice Works. So I am sometimes referred to as the mother of Equal Justice Works. And one of the things that's so amazing is 85% of the lawyers who take this fellowship end up in public interest law. And of course, that's another reason Bob and I bonded, with his Immigrant Justice Corps, because he understood the power of young lawyers and the impact we could have, and how important it was, access to justice, to help the underserved. So that program is something that I was really proud of, and it just took flight. And in more recent days, in the Norfleck litigation, which involved the John Hancock, because it was again a class action, and black people were given either really poorly written policies, were not given the same kind of policies that everybody else got. There was $15 million left. And the judge in that case, it was a settlement, and that was distributed to help in the black community in a variety of ways. And then there was another case that Joan Lefkoe had, Rebecca Pallmeyer had, that it involved the Latina community, and I think it was, it's some kind of financial thing. I can't remember now the exact facts, but over $6 million there, and it was distributed. So there hasn't been a lot of law on Cypre recently because it's been a settlement. it's always been the subject in more recent years of a settlement, and so that's the way the doctrine. But I think I was the first one to use the Cypre doctrine in that way.
Interesting. So you essentially gave life to something that has gone on beyond you, that has created opportunity not just for the law students and new lawyers, but also their clients, creating an institution. And I wanted to take a moment to reflect on this connection you mentioned with Judge Katzmann, who really did believe in the proper use of the power of the robe. I'll put it that way. Focusing on access to justice, civic education, making the courts a part of the community. Can you talk about your reflections on each of those? We've touched on it a little bit, but if you had further thoughts on that.
Yeah, and so Bob and I served, we were really fortunate, and that's how I got to really know him. I was president of the Federal Judges Association. We were working on pay issues, the cost of living, and Bob was very active in that. In fact, he was chair of the Judicial Branch Committee. When I was president of the Federal Judges Association, I worked with him on that. Ultimately, I was on the Supreme Court Fellows Commission with him. And in terms of beyond the robe, he and I basically had a philosophy, and this is why I loved him so much, that the robe, we have power. You know, the black robe means something. And that we have an obligation to have the public understand it. And so the Civic Education Center that he started, I was at the Judicial Branch Committee meeting when we were talking about that. And I was bringing kids into my courtroom when my son was in first grade. And always opened it up because I think the courthouse should be part of the community. And Bob really felt very strongly about that. And civic education, which again was a goal of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor with iCivics. You know, I now sit on the iCivics board. Bob got that unfortunately we have been so caught up in STEM and all these other things that there's been a detour from civics, and people don't understand their basic rights. And they don't understand how the country operates. And I mean, that's a critical thing. And then the access to justice, the number of people who are unable to get lawyers and representation and that don't understand their rights, the consequences are grave. And so on all of those things, we bonded, and we knew that we have convening power with the black robe. Now I'm talking about appropriately, because with just like the National Immigrant Justice Corps and the other organizations I started, like Just the Beginning, I could just call up lawyers that I knew that cared about public interest work and say, would you come to a meeting? You know, we're going to talk about a particular program. It would be great if you got involved. And they would come. And there wouldn't be like the competition between the law firms or like even like the law schools. I started this Jumpstart program because I always remembered what it was like for me getting in my little Volkswagen going to Willie Lipscomb's as a first generation lawyer. So we started a Jumpstart program. This is a really good example. So I brought all the law schools in Illinois into my chambers in district court. And I said, I'm very concerned about first generation kids, kids of color, kids who are underrepresented, where they stand in the class. And I think we should have a Jumpstart program where we tell them really what they need to know to be successful in their first year. Because I think the light bulb for some kids goes off at the end of first year, and we all know you need to have the light bulb go off way earlier because you need great grades to get a clerkship, to get in a firm. You need those grades. So the law school said, well, we have orientation. I said, and where do those kids fall in the class? Not at the top. So but I was able to bring them together. They had not worked together, all the law schools, on an initiative, but that's what I mean about the convening power. And so you have to recognize, to me as a judge, it's more than what you do in the courtroom because you have power. And he understood that you had to exercise it appropriately.
So you mentioned Just the Beginning Foundation. One of the other things that you were involved in is the start of that organization, which is now Just the Beginning Foundation, a pipeline organization. Among the things that the organization focuses on is creating opportunities for underrepresented students in the law, in the clerkship process. Could you talk a little bit about your reflections on the clerkship process and why this was important to you, both as someone who had been a law clerk and who then hired law clerks? And I also wanted to mention in this regard a recent study undertaken by Justice Goodwin Liu of the California Supreme Court, who wrote a fascinating article about the clerkship process, surveyed federal judges about their hiring practices and about the value they placed on diversity in a number of dimensions. And in that survey, with very few exceptions, judges indicated that they did think that it was important to have clerks of diverse backgrounds, but they had very different outcomes across the judges in terms of their hiring. And I'd just like your thoughts on all of that, both Just the Beginning Foundation and also the study by Justice Liu.
Well, we started Just the Beginning, a pipeline organization in honor of James Benton Parsons, who was the first black on a U.S. district court, happened to be from Chicago. And we had that gathering. Harry was at that gathering. And it was just remarkable because it was a weekend and we had the judges share their stories. So we had Constance Baker Motley, Leon Higginbotham, Damon Keith, like all these giants who told their stories. And we recognized there was power in their stories, and we wanted to provide alternative role models for students. And so we wrote a curriculum, we got it in for the public schools, and then when the teachers left, the curriculum died. You know, it's very difficult dealing with school systems. And so we thought we need to have our own program. So we started our summer legal camps for high school students to help them understand the law, very much like the Cecilia and Sonia Sotomayor program that's run here. And we then realized that we needed to focus on clerkships and internships. Internships where a law student can work for a judge for a summer, during the semester, and get the experience of working not only with the judge but the law clerks, so that they gain the experience, but they develop mentors, and they're able to move forward in the profession because, as I said, it's a golden ticket. It's a key. And so my view is having those kinds of programs and supporting those programs is good for the law, good for the judiciary, and can expand the number of students of color and from underrepresented groups into the ranks and help inspire them to become judges. So that's why I've always been, because I always remembered who I was. And Willie and Claire, have you done the reading? And we need, and it's just, everybody's in the law school because they're competent and they know they should be there. The question is, where's the confidence level? Who's gonna give them the 911 on exactly what they need to know? Like me, making that choice of being Willie's legal aid assistant director when I should have done moot court, in my opinion, because you need an academic credential. So telling students in advance and preparing them, I think, is really important.
I want to go far away. I want to go to Africa, which is a place where over the years you have devoted a lot of your time and your attention. I want to start by asking how you first got involved in legal issues in Africa, and then asking about what types of questions you have worked on and how you have developed this as part of your portfolio of things that you've worked on, both on the bench and now that you're at Jones Day.
Well, because I had taught at the Federal Judicial Center, there was a period for 7 years where I taught every class of baby judges. One of the baby judges was actually Justice Sonia Sotomayor, among others. And I had continued to teach at Northwestern. And I was teaching case management, ethics, and that kind of thing. But I was president of the Federal Judges Association in 2001, and I was invited to represent our association at an international association meeting of judges, and I got to go to Ghana. And I met the judges. I was invited back twice to do training. Then I got invited to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda to train prosecutors on trying cases and at the appellate level. And that then ultimately led to working with the Kenyan judiciary for many, many years in case management, human trafficking, you name it. And so I guess what was important to me, at least initially, was my mother. It comes back to my mother. She got to travel a lot. But the one place she didn't get to go was to the motherland, as she would say. And so I think going to Africa like that, I'm fulfilling a dream of my mother's, number one. Number two, I feel like I've received so many blessings in my life, and a lot of hands have been extended to me of all colors, all races, all backgrounds, and I wouldn't be here without the help of others to get me where I am. And so I feel that when you have those blessings, you have an obligation to give back. And so that's the second reason. The third reason is because I see the light in the eyes of everyone I work with and partner with for justice under very difficult circumstances. They get up every day. For example, in Kenya, there are no court reporters. So judges are taking the record, making rulings, and deciding credibility. Just imagine. Now, there are some countries in Africa where there are, there are recordings and everything, but they get up every day and they try to do justice. And so that inspires me. That inspires me to do the work that I've been doing. And I was fortunate to get the opportunity with Jones Day, so that my full-time position is helping to develop the rule of law in Africa, and to work on pro bono initiatives and projects to engage my partners and associates to help with the rule of law. And recently, I was just in Kenya, and all the years that I've been in the 9 countries I've been going to for over 20 years, I can't even count the number of trips I've made. It's very clear that even if there's electronic filing, even if it's the best organization, even if they hire hundreds of judges and lawyers, they're just as litigious as we are. And they can't keep up with the backlog. So mediation, to me, is a key. Mediation, restorative justice. So I helped convene a conference there that we had 1,400 people attend, 500 live, the rest remotely, because we know that's going to make a difference, working with the Chief Justice, the Governor of the Central Bank. So when I'm doing this work, I'm working at this level. And again, having worn the black robe helps give me access. It gives me access and it gives me credibility. So I will continue. And of course, we do things like human trafficking and other things. It's not just on the commercial side. But, I mean, that's why I keep going back.
So I want to ask you to reflect about the black robe, about the role of the judge. You have taken opportunities to effect real, long-lasting change, but the judiciary as an institution is one that is constrained in many ways. The canons put limits on what judges can do. Do you think, first of all, that your role as a judge enhanced or limited the types of change that you could effect? And then related to that, if you had never been a judge, if you'd taken a different path in the law, do you think you would have had the same instinct for trying to effect positive change?
I'll start with the first one, the last question first. Oh, I think I would have had the instinct to help make change. Because I always believed, because my parents taught me this too, in the power of one. The power of one person to have an idea, a good idea, a strategic idea, and the ability of that one to bring a lot of other ones together to move forward. So I always believed in that. I always believed it. And I did start one organization when I was a baby lawyer, Minority Legal Education Resources, Inc., because there was a problem with blacks and the passage rate. It wasn't equal to the overall rate. And I became
This is a
the
bar
bar
exam.
review. Yeah, so the bar exam. And I was aware that there was a program Professor Ron Kennedy had started at Northwestern, but he just had it for students from Northwestern. I, of course, tried to get in it, but I went to Notre Dame, but I never forgot. And so 2 years later, as an assistant, one of the guys I work with had been in that program. I went to him and I said, Al, is Professor Kennedy still doing the program? Yes. Do they still have 100% pass rate? Yes. I said, is it still just limited to Northwestern? He said, yes. I think it should be expanded. Will you set up a meeting with me? So we went to see the professor. I said, Professor, I think you should expand it. He said, I don't. I have 100% pass rate. And who are you? You know what I mean? So I said, well, how about this? How about if you train me and my friends? We have a non-Northwestern group. We have a Northwestern group. If we have the same pass rate, can we talk? And that's what we did. And we had the same pass rate. So we started MLER. It's an all-volunteer organization. First it was free. Now it costs kids about $300. They use it as a supplement. It's all based on writing exams, taking exams, having them graded. You know, a lawyer who just passed, a lawyer in the middle of their career, an experienced lawyer helping people pass the bar. I did that as a baby lawyer. So I was always committed. When I went on the bench, I helped start the Black Women Lawyers Association. I helped start Just the Beginning. And the other thing, I just want to comment on this. So these are organizations, of course, that, you know, fall in the category of working with people who are underserved, who haven't had opportunities and that kind of thing. But I am also a big believer in those organizations sort of nurturing your soul, whatever they are, and how important it is to get to the larger legal community if you're going to have some influence. And so that work with the Federal Judicial Center and meeting every class of brand new federal judges, being president of the Federal Judges Association, when I was up for the Court of Appeals, I was in a way different position, Dean, because I had been president of the association, so I knew judges all across the country. You have to be very careful when you're up for that kind of appointment. You can't ask people to help you, but I had judges saying, what can we do for you, Annie? They had seen me in leadership positions. I had worked at the Judicial Conference. Justice Rehnquist had appointed me chair of the Court Administration and Case Management Committee and put me on the Judicial Branch Committee and all these other things. So there were people around the country that stood up for me, that knew what I stood for. And so that, I know I've gotten off slightly, but I just think it's really important that if you want to affect change, you have to do it appropriately. And it's like one person at a time. It's like, you know, when you join an organization, you don't just join and pay your dues. Like, you need to do things and you need to be innovative. So even within the judiciary, you know, when I first went on the district court, you know, all the groups, the women's groups, the black groups, the minority groups, the legal aid groups, all wanted you to come and talk to the students. Like, it was like, I just couldn't do it. It was just like too much. And also the bar associations wanted you to come to everything. So lawyers were always asking questions about how things worked in the courts. So I started with our Federal Bar Association, what judges want. And every year we had a panel of 3 or 4 judges that actually talked to the lawyers about what they wanted. And then about the 20 minutes in, I would say, flip it and say, and what do lawyers expect from judges? So that was a way to like bring the community together. And I mentioned bringing kids in the courtroom. And so I worked with Bob a lot on that, having a plan in our courthouse, because not every judge was a teacher. And so I was a teacher at heart. So it kind of came to me what to do, but not every judge does. So to have a toolkit so judges can welcome people in the courtroom. So all of those things, I think, I feel very passionately about that. And now I can't remember what the question was.
Oh,
So
no,
remind
but
me.
the answer was fantastic. So, but before we close, I wanted to give you some time just for some final reflections. But there was one question I did want to ask you. Was there any time where there was an opportunity to engage in a reform effort of some kind that you thought, I really want to do this, but as a judge, I just don't think I can do it?
Well, of course, we have canons of ethics. We can't do any fundraising or anything. So these organizations I talked about, like Just the Beginning was doing a conference every other year, and lawyers were raising the money. We're very, very careful not to have us on any of the fundraising. And then when it turned out that Just the Beginning was trying to support programs, we made the board all non-judges. Judges were just advisors. I'm very aware of the Code of Ethics and have always adhered to the Code of Ethics. So I guess one area that was really difficult, I wanted to work to help with some reform for immigration judges. I mean, their task is it's a nightmare. They don't have the resources, and they don't have the training. They're not part of the judicial center. And that was a place where I ran into a roadblock because I couldn't, they're under the Department of Justice, and so I was not able to do that. But I can't think of any other sort of thing that I've thought about doing that I wasn't able to move forward with. I can't think of anything right at the moment.
So do you have any final thoughts before we close?
I do have some final thoughts, and they're about Bob Katzman. And so that I wouldn't get too emotional, I just wanted to have these thoughts, and then there's something else I'd like to do. But Nelson Mandela said, "A winner is a dreamer who never gives up." He also said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." A winner is a dreamer who never gives up. It always seems impossible until it's done. Bob Katzman was a winner who dreamed big, impossible dreams, and he worked his whole life to make those dreams come true. His strategic vision, his use of power given to him, the black robe, his big heart, his big, big heart, matched all of his big dreams, his kindness to everyone. Anyone who knew him was blessed to be in his presence, from the cleaning people to presidents. He taught us to dream impossible dreams and make them possible. So I'm going to sing my favorite song, a favorite of Bob's, in gratitude and thankfulness for my brother, who will always inspire us, who we will always carry in our hearts, and who taught us to dream impossible dreams. Now, I have changed the words to protect the innocent. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and strong who we are, to try when our arms are too weary, to reach the unreachable star. That was Bob Katzman's quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for what's right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause, equal justice his cause. And we know if we'll always be true to this great justice quest, that our hearts will be peaceful and calm like Bob's, knowing we did our best. And the world, yes, our world, all the world will be better for this, that we all, standing up, standing tall, we still strive with our last ounce of courage to reach, to reach, to reach the unreachable star. Thank you, Bob. I love you.